Catholic schools before?
Yes, I have.
What schools?
Well, when I was back in the 50s, early 50s, I'd been in the seminary. I had to leave because of a health problem. But the Archbishop of St. Louis, at that time, he later became Cardinal Ritter, had me teach in two high schools I'd never taught before. And I taught the first year in a close school called De Andreas, was up in North St. Louis. And I was amazed. I taught American history, church history, and citizenship. And I taught this to juniors in the school there. And I was amazed to find out, because every school I'd been in before, my fellow students could read and write. But I found out that the juniors in this particular school were not able to read or write. In South St. Louis, near the old Jefferson Barracks, and that was called a co-instructional school. They had not, and this school was co-instructional. By that they had boys and girls, but they were in separate classes. He said, why don't you go into publishing? So I applied for jobs, and I found a job in Westminster, Maryland, for the old Newman Press. It was called the Newman Press. It's now owned by the Paulus Fathers. But at that wanted to get married, but there weren't very few Catholic girls in the small town of Westminster, Maryland at that particular time. So after about a year working there, I decided I could get out of there. So I applied for a job at the Bruce Publishing Company in Milwaukee, where I knew there'd be plenty of girls. And they gave me a job, but it wasn't in the editorial department. I was in editorial work at the Newman Press. But they promised me they'd get me into that as soon as they could. And I worked in the advertising department for about a year. Then they had an opening in the editorial department. I went to the editorial department. I went working for them in 1955. Your grandmother, met her there in Milwaukee at a dance in December the 13th, 1957. We got married in And then I finally ended up getting a job at Catholic University teaching moral theology in 1971. And I stayed there at the university as a teaching there until 1991, for 20 years. And then I was offered a job at this new institute that John Paul II had started, called the John Paul II Institute. He taught them what I call the hermeneutic of suspicion, that if the church teaches something, it's probably false. And so I considered it my duty when they came to me in the second year to suggest to them that maybe what the church teaches is true and there are good reasons for it. But it was a hard job until about the middle of by 1980s, there was beginning to change, because at that time the influence of John Paul II was taking root, and you got a new kind of seminarians, and they didn't have this hermeneutic of suspicion. And finally, I had to play a devil's advocate, because they were the kind who thought that their opponents were either stupid or morally depraved, and I said that's false. They ask intelligent questions, you have to know to answer them, and so forth and so on. Curran was eventually told he could no longer teach at the Catholic University because he was no longer going to be considered a Catholic theologian. That was in 1988, I believe, or 89, something like that. And he was forced then to leave the university, and he's now down at the Southern Methodist University, where he teaches moral theology at the Southern Methodist University in San Antonio, but his comrades were still very influential in the department until we had a new president. He came after I left there. There was a Father O'Connell, who was a Vincentian priest, who came there in 1993, I believe, 1992 or 93, to begin as the rector. And he was very good because he got rid of the bad guys. He knew how to cut them off and to soak off their student body and to change the regulations. And so they gradually died off, and they've been replaced now by pretty good people, so the place has changed remarkably. In the meantime, it's a very good place now, yeah. Father Kern's a very pleasant man personally. He's a very personable fellow, but he's a very hard-boiled guy. I remember in 1978, he's the only one who ever prevented me from giving a talk at a Catholic school. The campus minister and the Department of Religion and Education sponsored his talk. I wrote to them and I said, could I give a response to his talk? And they said, no, Bill, but it would embarrass us, but we'll announce that you can give a talk on the same subject a week from now, okay? And we'll announce that when we introduce Father Kern. When I went into the big hall where he was going to give his talk, there were about 500 people there. I was stopped by the campus minister, and he says, I'm sorry, I can't announce that you're going to give a talk on the same subject next week. I said, why not? And he said, because Father Kern said that would embarrass him. They would think that what he's teaching is not Catholic teaching, whereas he doesn't want them to have their opinion. So after I started, well, as far as writing began, I started writing when I was still a graduate student at Marquette University. In fact, I wrote 2 articles, papers I'd written for the classes. They were in philosophy, of course, but I wrote 2 of them that were published by the New Scholasticism, which is the journal of the American Catholic Philosophical Association. And then when I got to Catholic University, you had to publish for parish, you know. So I published quite a bit. I was very industrious in publishing things. In fact, I had 2 books by the time I was able to get tenure from them. I had a book on bioethics at that particular time. It was called Human Existence Medicine and Medicine and Ethics and so forth. In ethics, that was my first book, I think, that was published out there. Then I had another book on Becoming Human. It was another book I wrote for that particular time. I've changed my mind quite a bit since the time I wrote that particular book. Then I had another book that came out relatively shortly after I began teaching. That was a book on another book on bioethics. No, an introduction to moral theology. That was it. And I translated the book too. Then from the Italian, which had been written originally in Spanish, but had been translated into Italian, called Marriage in the Tradition, the Documents of the Magisterium of the Church. I translated that from Italian into English. I've translated some other books from Italian into English. And then I used to write about 6 or 7 articles a year that would be published in academic journals, such as the New Scholasticism, the Linacre Quarterly, the American Journal of Jurisprudence, and journals of this kind, and all throughout the entire world, the Scripta Theologica, and now it's Theologici, a number of other studies. I had trouble getting articles published in the theological studies, because theological studies was at that time dominated by a man named Richard McCormick, who was, in my opinion, even worse than Charlie Kern. Richard McCormick always wore his clerical outfits, but he didn't say that the church's teaching was wrong. He said it has to be interpreted the right way, and he would misinterpret it all the times. I debated with him several times, and as a matter of fact, I got paid the most for a debate. I'm giving a talk at a college up in New York. I was asked they asked me how much I would charge. I said I would charge $100. He charged $500, so they said, since we're paying him $500, we'll give you $500. That was the best fee I ever received at that time, till that time, giving a talk someplace else. So McCormick then taught he was at the Kennedy Center for Bioethics in Georgetown University for a while. Then he ended up at Notre Dame University teaching moral theology there. He died about 10 years ago now, probably.
Okay. Do you think that your books and writings have made a difference in Catholic education?
I think they have, because they're very widely used. I have one book that was published was called Catholic Sexual Teaching, a summary, a defense, a summary, and a defense and that was published with three of us to begin with in 1984. The first edition, Father Ronald Lawler and Joseph Boyle and I were the ones who published.
Okay.
The second edition came out in 1998, but then a new one was just published in 2011, and since Lawler was dead and Boyle no longer wanted to do anything with it, I was the complete author of the revised edition that came out in 2011.
What's the name of the book?
It's called Catholic Sexual Teaching, a Summary, Explanation, and Defense. And that has sold over 50,000 copies. Okay, it's been widely used. It still sells about 4,000 copies a year, and I get nice royalties from it, so I'd like to continue that in publication. Then I have a book in bioethics that's going to go into its third printing in June of this year, and that's been widely used too, and that's I had to revise it, so I'm always revising books. And I just did a book on the theology of the body in 2009. Okay, so, and I have over 250 articles that were published in scholarly journals. Okay, so.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I will be the one you say goodnight to. Let me first say that you're so charming. Don't you think that you could